Thank you. Just to get the ball rolling, something that I've noticed, one of these like signs of the times, I don't know if you'd call it this, but it's something very significant, is that people now are being forced to wear masks in order to go out into public and to interact with one another.
Mm-hmm.
Things like this, I mean, it's becoming so, let's say, overt, the things that were once, metaphorical, that we wear masks in public and with one another. I mean, what would you say about these sorts of things?
Well, I think what you said is sufficient in a way. I think that the mask has two sides to it. One is that it's very much like the Jains, who wear masks in order not either to inadvertently breathe in some bug that's flying around and killing it because they're nonviolent, and not wanting to contaminate if they did have any germs. So this is actually an ancient tradition, and you have surgeons wearing masks, right, for the same idea. So in a way, it is spiritualizing people to have that kind of a forced purity in their way of relating. If you want to be a fundamentalist Jain about it. But on the other hand, as you say, the ego is a mask, and people have been wearing them for a long time and not being in naked awareness. And this at least is a recognition at a very palpable physical level that the social order demands that we wear a false identity that acquiesces with the rules of society. But usually it's more subtly done, and now because we're in a state of exception and the governing authority wants to impress upon people their powerlessness and their enslavement to an absurd system of rules that actually has no real scientific basis for it, is having a huge effect upon the human spirit. And I think it is breaking a lot of the given assumptions of capitalism in the past, that people would have autonomy and free will and the ability to wear what they want and to appear in whatever ways and associate freely and assemble freely. So all of that is being taken away, and I think that it's deliberately ripping away the mask of the ego's sense of complacency that it is in control of its environment, because every day the rules change. One day you have to wear the mask, the next day you don't, and one day you can travel and the next day you don't, and you can travel from certain places but not from others, and to certain but not, and none of it really makes sense if you analyze it. So it's the arbitrariness of the situation in which everyone is under the control of some power that has not been legislated or given any other legitimacy of authority, and yet is able to control the entire population by force, is, I think, producing a cognitive dissonance that is actually awakening people and creating growth. Of course, in some, and in others, just fury and resistance or hopelessness and despair and all of that. So everyone is reacting differently, but everyone is being moved out of their comfort zone into another state of consciousness that is groundless and unknown and uncertain. And I think it's that uncertainty that is opening the potentiality for actual spiritual transformation and liberation, even though I don't think that's the intention of the authorities that are doing this. But I actually think that this is bringing the potentiality for a higher level of human consciousness to emerge in the chaos that is ensuing, and allowing the emergence of a new order of a higher consciousness at a global level, because this is a planet-wide situation that never before would have been possible. So it's actually a tremendous blessing if we know how to respond to it without falling into one of those negative reactivities. Okay, so, but thank you for bringing that up. And if you have anything else you want to add to that of your own insights or anyone else about the significance for you or for the world of these rules like masks, please feel free. Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Durga.
Thank you. You just mentioned now again how learning could be destabilizing and destabilizing, and it feels kind of the opposite of what one expected learning to be. Like, oh, now I know more, I'm more empowered. But actually, sometimes it has the opposite effect. Like I remember when I learned about the like how Darwinism wasn't correct and how destabilizing that was, but how it's a paradox. How will you say that learning empowers you by disempowering the ego? Like how is it that relationship?
Oh yeah, sure. That's a very good question. You know, it's very similar to people who take up weightlifting. And when you do the weightlifting, it actually breaks down your muscles, but then when they repair themselves, they come back stronger. So there's a certain way in which the ego puts itself together, what we call them assemblage points, right? It puts itself together at a certain level of consciousness, of maturity, of depth, of subtlety, of understanding within a frame of reference with certain master signifiers and certain constructs, because basically that's all the ego is a construct. And so learning involves deconstructing it in order to open your consciousness to information and potentialities that were not able to be put in place at the level of consciousness that congealed as the ego identity. And then as it gets destabilized or de-differentiated, it then can put itself together at a higher level, now putting this new information into a more coherent paradigm. And then that will get taken apart, and one will be able to put oneself together again at an even higher level. So this usually has to happen at a number of different levels, and each time one will have to feel groundless and lost and completely in a tabula rasa, in an unknown self, in an unknown reality, and then the puzzle will come together at a new level, and there'll be an aha and a capacity to resonate at a much higher vibrational frequency with a much more expanded capacity to understand and relate to a much larger set of the information that constitutes reality, until eventually one will get to that infinite level where you don't actually put yourself together again. You realize that you are the whole that can never be identified as any particular being. It's just an infinity of infinities of potentiality that continually emerge, and there is simply an awesome witnessing that participates in the emission of whatever spontaneous insights, information, joy, love, beauty that emerges as a fountain from one's source. And one is just in the state of bliss, in this continual realization of the potentialities of consciousness. Thank you.
Thank you. It led me to a question, because I've been thinking about my resistance to teaching that I used to do in the past. And it's because when you break or destroy a paradigm of someone, it goes into that state, and it happened to me for years. But how do you offer safety and containment in that intermediate state where you destroy the paradigm or the worldview of the person, and it can go into the wrong way too? Like how do you offer safety?
Well, it's done in the context of love and of joy and of growth, and of becoming different from what one was, and thought one was, in a way that eliminates the suffering that was inherent to who you thought you were before. So the unraveling is like a kind of surgery that removes pains that were caused by holding on to illusory beliefs that were keeping one in a very limited or self-attacking mode of consciousness, and allows one freedom then to one's full creative expression of one's possibilities, without them being limited by suppressed impulses or capacities to act, or inhibitions of some kind, or anxieties. So the benefits to the letting go of what one thought one was is much enhanced freedom and much enhanced sense of what is possible to one, without a preconceived limitation of the script of what is acceptable to the other, or what one actually is able to accomplish or to express. And it's that increase in freedom that brings the joy that says, okay, let's deconstruct even more. Let's see what I'm still holding on to, until finally the I thought itself is able to let go. And then what the I thought really represented but inhibited and suppressed is able to emerge fully. And then one realizes, why didn't I do this all along, you know? But one has to go through that process of learning and unlearning, and then of course the learning from the source rather than from the reality. So or from, let's say, the phenomenal plane of reality. So in the beginning, the ego is based on the idea that it's a creature in a world full of people who know more than I do, and I have to learn from them. And then one realizes, no, it's actually a projection, and you are the source of the world that you are in, and it's a dream, and you can redream it. And that power to dream will be enhanced the more you let go of any of the limitations on that creative power of manifestation that is inherent to your being. So your life improves, the quality of the life, the types of opportunities that magically emerge, the synchronicities, the meaningfulness of different events and the implications, and all of it, it becomes a much richer life and consciousness that one is in, and that richness is so great that one is happier and happier to let go of whatever remains of let's say, a limited identity structure. Okay. Okay. Is that Jose? Who is that?
Thanks. I have seen how even the conscious mind lies. Like the ego manages to put in disorder words, and sometimes you even can ask wrong question, that if you think about it twice, the question itself does not make sense. And I have seen also with the sessions with Radama how when the pain releases, the heart can open more. And so I wanted to ask, because the mind lies a lot, sometimes without me even noticing. Does my heart lie? Can the heart lie, or is the heart trust? That's why we are trying to heal it, right? Because then we can listen. The heart cannot lie. Is what I understand.
Yes, a very good question and a very good insight. You're right. The mind, not every mind lies, and not every mind lies in the same way at the ego level. But the more you were brought up in a family in which certain things couldn't be spoken about, there was a lot of forbidden knowledge. There were skeletons in the closet you couldn't talk about. And there were feelings you couldn't express. You couldn't tell people how angry you were at certain things they did or said, or how sad you were, because they'd say, smile, be happy, and they wouldn't understand, right? So you learned that you had to lie, and the only way you could get what you wanted from them was by lying. And so, yes, you were taught to lie. The family system almost forced you to lie, and you had to lie to yourself so you wouldn't know you were lying, so you could do it with a straight face. And so, yes, your personality became totally false and defended against your heart, because your heart was broken underneath that. You didn't want to have to live a lie. No one wants to really have to do that. But once you felt forced to, and there were too many traumas underneath to dare open up, then of course you would have to continue it and even strengthen the lies because it was too painful to open it up in a way that wouldn't be contained. And that's why the sessions are so important, because you can feel contained there. Radhama can handle what you're saying, and there's no judgment, and you can let it go and then see it from a higher state of consciousness and realize it's the past. It doesn't have to control you now. There's no reason to lie anymore. Now discover who you really are in truth, and let your heart be the guiding force that it drives your life, not the mind any longer. And you'll live in love, and the wisdom of the heart will turn your life into a beautiful work of art. So I'm very happy to hear the progress that you're making, Jose. It's very great, and it shows the greatness of your courage to be able to let go of so much so quickly. So,
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. I had a few questions, but to start with one at a time. Why do we have a body?
Who has a body?
Why the illusion? Why perceived this? Why this? The thing that we're discussing getting out of. I'm just saying, why do we have it?
Well, the body is a vehicle for consciousness that enables consciousness to have certain kinds of experiences that you don't have in deep sleep, right? In deep sleep, you don't have a body. When you wake up, what that means is you come back into your body. And when you're in your body, you're able to have a kind of relationality that enables the various kinds of potentialities of your being to emerge. And for you to be seen by another, that enables you to see aspects of yourself that you might not otherwise become conscious of. So the body is a vehicle that enables you to grow to that point where you realize that the body is like the larval stage of consciousness. And then you go from the caterpillar to the butterfly, and you realize you are actually bodiless. Sometimes this happens through a near-death experience where you actually go out of body and into the light, and you realize you're a being of light and an angel all along. But then you come back in your body and you use it as a vehicle to help others realize that they are bodiless. So it's part of the growth. The whole world is kind of a school, a spiritual school, and the body enables us to have the education that then enables us to live in a bodiless state as the whole infinite unified field of consciousness that is bodiless. And then we learn that the body is a dream body. So in the same way you have a body at night, if you have a dream, it's a different body. And that body will go through different kinds of experiences that are guided by a different level of intelligence. And you can eventually get to that state where you are comfortable in the bodiless presence that is completely egoless. So there's a constant growth process to higher and more expanded states of consciousness that eventually will let go of the anchor of identification with the body and achieve total liberation.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What is the purpose of the ego then in this construct? Why do we even have it?
Because without the ego, you would not be able to adapt to society. That's basically what the role of the ego is. It's to tell you who you are in relationship to this phenomenal plane. So there's a basis for learning and symbolic growth of understanding. So you are to learn to use language. The basic instrument of the ego is language, and it creates the capacity for interpersonal relationships. And then you get to the point where you no longer are functioning at an ego level, which is always trying to get approval of the other. That's because as a child you want the parents' approval and their love. And the ego realizes that it has become enslaved to the need for the approval of others and to a sense of power and territoriality and security and sensual gratification, and it has created a whole complex of needs and of traits that actually limit its growth. And even the symbolic capacity that leads to your ability to understand abstract thought, logic, mathematics, science, philosophy, metaphysics, all of that, eventually you outgrow even that and you realize, where did all of those concepts come from? That there's a higher level of intelligence, and you grow from the ego level to the soul level, and then even beyond the soul level to the pure spirit. So again, it's all part of a growth process in which the ego is the seed, and then the seed grows into the tree, and then the tree finally gives the fruit of this tree of life, which is eternal, infinite consciousness.
So if we're starting from that state of divinity and soul and eternal consciousness, what is the purpose in coming back to this state to go through this process?
Well, we come from it, but not consciously. Okay, when we first come down, there's a spontaneous understanding, but it hasn't yet been fully grokked consciously. So we are going from a state of purity, but an unconscious one, like a child may have an innocence and a joy that will be lost once the ego is installed. But that joy was not sustainable because it was still in ignorance of the true nature of reality. So we have to go through this path of learning, which can involve suffering, in order then to gain the wisdom that enables us to become catalysts for the healing of others and develop our compassion, and then return to that ultimate joy, but now with wisdom that enables us to be liberated from this wheel of birth and rebirth and not come back, but go to an even higher state of consciousness. So again, it's all part of a process of elevation until we reach that state of the absolute. But there are so many levels of this reality in fractal phase spaces that we grow from very small to very large, and our consciousness expands not only in terms of the sense of who we are and what we are capable of as an individual, but into a cosmic consciousness in which there's a total interconnectivity and not a sense of separation. And we grow from even out of the cosmos into the multiverse, into levels of awareness that are so far beyond the human level of imagination that it's too awesome even to be able to render into language. But it's that state of growing into an infinity of infinities is what's underway, and we are in the midst of it, but there is an infinite way to go. And it is more and more awesome and glorious and joyous as we gain the intelligence to recognize the perfection of it all, and that there really is no suffering and there is no world. It's all part of the creative imagination of the one self. And the more that we realize that, the more that we merge into that infinite intelligence, and there's just a sense of infinite gratitude and of love and of peace.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
In the class, I'm just getting it might be just my mirror reflection, perceived good and bad. And
no such thing. That's the illusion we have to get out of. No, there's no good or bad, but if we understand consciousness as being vertical, at the lower levels, there's more density, there's more limitation, there's more negativity, there's more suffering, there's more egocentricity, narcissism, power struggling, all of that. And at the higher levels, there's more love, joy, bliss, and all of that. So eventually one realizes one would like to live a life of joy and bliss, not of suffering and hatred and anger and trauma and all of that. And so one chooses that. But the idea that there is some difference between good and bad or good and evil is an illusion of Maya that's only present at the lower levels, and that's exactly what we want to be liberated from.
Is in the context of being liberated from something inherently provided judgment about it?
No.
Or resistance to it?
No, I think it's an inherent process of growth that you want to have a wider and deeper understanding of what reality is. And growth does go into in a certain direction, but it's a direction of increase of subtlety and maturity and sensitivity and power that is not about judgment, it's not about morality. It's simply about the capacity to understand and have compassion and have the ability to help others who are suffering and who are still in that duality of good and bad and who are often attacking themselves for not being good enough or all of that. So we want to help people be liberated from that state of duality. But to do that does require growth to the level in which you are not subject to superego voices that are telling you that you're not good enough and that you deserve to suffer, and that may repeat the same patterns that result in suffering even unconsciously. So what we may say is good is freedom and joy and empowerment, and what is not so good is enslavement to obsolete patterns that create more suffering. But again, that's a choice that everyone makes, and if you choose to remain in the ego and to suffer and say, no, I'm not getting out of it, that's fine. Reality itself, however, will turn the screw, and eventually it tends to make people want to go for liberation because the suffering gets intolerable. But that's not a question of moral judgment. That's simply a question of what reality itself is, and the direction that reality is pushing your consciousness to understand.
Okay. And one last question. Can you define karma from your perspective?
Well, again, karma is an illusion. There's no such thing because we are actually unborn. And we are actually the dreamers of this dream. The real self has no karma. The karma is based on the false identification of consciousness with body. And as long as the consciousness is identified with the body going through space and time, that body is going to go through certain kinds of experiences that will either bring joy or suffering, or a combination of both. And so the gain of wisdom that comes from wanting to live a life intelligently and maximize the joy and minimize the suffering, which is generally what somebody will want to do inherently. They don't have to be told you should be more joyous and less suffering. But that wisdom that will come from experience, assuming one learns from one's experience, is how one gets out of karma. And especially how to make good karma instead of bad karma, but really to get beyond the illusion of karma itself.
I might have missed something. Can you explain the illusion of karma, especially in the context of being good and bad in this reference of what you're discussing right now?
Well, good and bad is something you're usually taught when you're very young. That's bad and that's good, and you're a good boy for doing this and a bad one for that. So that's what often creates the let's say, the context of the ego's structure and its degree of dissociation and fragmentation and internal conflict. So it is a state that already pre-exists when one enters a spiritual path, and one wants to really understand and deconstruct the good and bad that is already present. Like your question implies that you already have a notion of good and bad, and that there is some sense in yourself that to make a judgment about good and bad is bad, right? So any kind of a judgment is going to create karma. So we want to be in a state that's free of all judgment.
Okay. So what is karma?
Well, karma in the actual technical sense means action. Okay, so it is in the physical world. Every action is going to produce a reaction. Mm-hmm. Okay, if you insult somebody, the odds are they're going to insult you back or something. What goes around comes around, right? That's karma, basically. So if you want to live a life in which you don't have negative events happening to you, you will live a life in which you're emanating a certain kind of energy of love, let's say, and of gratitude and helpfulness that will then return. It will boomerang. It will come back and increase your happiness. Whereas if you act in other ways, it will increase your unhappiness and you'll make enemies instead of friends, that kind of thing. So your own actions and their intentions will produce effects. So we want to learn from the effects that our thoughts and our actions have had, and then by changing those, we change the type of life that we're living in.
So it's kind of the law of attraction through intention and action.
Yeah, that's part of it.
As a piece. Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. Makes sense. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Let's see. Anyone else?
Can I ask one follow-up?
Oh, sure.
Thank you. Just to follow up on the ego question, would you say that ego or souls kind of go through a progression, and that in each lifetime you're learning and going through different emotions and different traumas so that you're ascending as a soul, let's say, to get more and more to the light, and that perhaps that's why you have an ego in each lifetime, and subconsciously or whatever the word, you would have that ego in order to go through these traumas, in order to learn, in order to ascend as a soul?
No.
No? Okay.
No. Actually, it works the opposite of that, because there's a process of entropy. And so your soul is like a battery, and in each life the battery gets discharged a little bit. Very few souls keep their battery charged. Some do, but most don't. And so one tends to get to lower and lower levels of consciousness. That's why we are now at the end of time in a Kali Yuga. We're not in a Sat Yuga. We're not in a golden age. We're in an iron age. We're in an age of war and torture and hatred and savagery and all of that we know. And our karma is all hitting the fan. It's happened because collectively we've all fallen to too low a level of consciousness. If we go back many lifetimes, we didn't even have egos. We lived in soul consciousness. And before that, even in earlier lives, in very high cultures, we lived in pure spirit consciousness, not even in soul. So we've gradually fallen, and the ego itself has morphed. It's not a constant. The ego structures have morphed. Even in the last 50 years, they have morphed. In fact, even we teach the soy burger, it's obsolete. That's actually not any longer the structure of the postmodern ego. But we don't get into those complexities in the immersion week. But there's much more depth to understand about egos in different structures. But the ego gradually becomes so heavy, so egocentric, so dense, and so unwilling to learn, so resistant, that it falls into a state of total suffering and despair for the most part. So we see an epidemic of suicides and hopelessness and drug addiction and all kinds of things happening today that weren't happening in the past. And so we have to make a very rapid rise to a higher level of consciousness at the end, seeing how bad things are, seeing the trajectory, and having a very small window of opportunity to change that trajectory. And it's that urgency, in fact, that is necessary to our awakening. If things weren't as bad as they are now, we wouldn't need to awaken to higher states. So they had to get this way. But they got this way because we fell to lower states and no longer kept up the incorruptible structures that kept society sane and peaceful and healthy and all of that. And we fell into all of the institutions of society lost their credibility, their wisdom. We don't produce any more statesmen of great wisdom or artists even or visionaries. There are very few people who are able to see beyond the current situation and bring about a higher state or even imagine that one is possible. So now we have to awaken to those original potentialities again. Okay. Mm-hmm. Ashok.
We live in a culture that basically, or for a long time, repressed the existence of death in a way, without recognizing it. And as we're seeing on the news, death is being reintroduced in a way, in a very violent way to our culture. And our next retreat is on deathlessness.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering, why did you choose that theme at this time?
Okay. Most egos are obsessed with birth control. And yogis are concerned with death control. So it's a very different understanding. And you see, all the spiritual traditions have always been about overcoming the illusion of death. And therefore the fear of death and all of the consequences of our life. Even if we deny death, we nonetheless have much more limited kinds of lives because of the unspoken fear of non-existence and of the void. And we've created a culture that is pretty much atheistic and that doesn't believe that consciousness exists after the death of the body, because most people are taught that it's produced by the brain, and once there is a flatlining of the brain, that there is no consciousness. Of course, the evidence from near-death experiences completely refutes that, but nonetheless, that's still the way that people are indoctrinated into believing. So the overcoming of death and the fear of death and the karma that we produce out of being in a state of fear and of body identification that causes us to act in certain ways of emotionality and grief when people who are related to our bodies die and we feel a loss because we've identified with them. That creates a tremendous emotional fragility and then an inability to continue to grow because we have trapped ourselves in an identification with a limited biological group. And we don't recognize that our consciousness is infinite and universal and beyond universal and eternal. So to overcome that illusion enables us to live freely and to bring in the what comes along with the deathless consciousness, which is infinite creativity and joy and love that isn't dented by fear and by grief and by trauma. So the overcoming of the fear of death brings us the ability to live fully. That's one of the paradoxes. But in order to live fully, we have to actually die to the ego, because the ego is not living fully. The ego is a very cramped form of consciousness that is full of rules of good and bad, and of yes and no, and of should and shouldn't, and of self-attacks, and of needing to get the approval of the other, etc., so that we are not able to live full, joyous, open lives in the largest context possible, and to connect at the highest levels with the whole unified field of the cosmos and the creator of the cosmos. So the overcoming of death through the dying to the ego and even to the soul, because the soul too is a vehicle, a more subtle vehicle than the ego, but still a vehicle. So we want to die to, or transcend, which is probably a better word, a more positive word for most people, transcend those limited identifications of all the 7 bodies that I think people have been studying this week, and realize that we are beyond all of them, and to get into that, return to the infinite nature of our unlimited being. And then that can be poured into these bodies and expressed, and the vibrational frequency of the deathless consciousness can spread through the morphogenetic field of all of the rays of consciousness that are still captured by the ego or one of the other 7 bodies, and free them from that capture, and enable everyone to rise to a state that we can co-dream a new world that is beautiful and free of suffering and all of the torments that the world is subject to today. So until we achieve deathlessness, we will not have that freedom that is our birthright as divine beings. That's what we want to grant ourselves again through the growth process that brings us to the realization that we are indeed unborn, uncreated, and deathless. Okay. Thank you, Ashok. Anyone else? Vajra.
Does the wisdom that's discovered in one cycle of yugas get rediscovered in the next cycle of yugas? Because I was reading how in the Tibetan tradition they hide termas in the sky, and that the discoverer can attune to it through consciousnness. So I was wondering if in the next cycle of yugas it's a new and different learning, or if it's the same learnings over and over again as we go through the yugas.
Yeah, the termas are generally put in for the future in a particular cycle of time, a particular kalpa. Not for future kalpas, but for later periods. So it's a teleological time capsule that's put into the future that will then be discovered at a certain moment when that information is necessary. That also happens on a physical level. Like there'll be certain discoveries, like the Nag Hammadi Gospels were discovered, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Dunhuang Caves, Tibetan Zen texts. So those discoveries that all happened at the end of Kali Yuga also gave us a much more expanded understanding of what Christianity really was meant to be in those original texts that were banished and completely forgotten and excluded from consciousness. So, and the same with the early Buddhist texts and others. So we are constantly being given the information we need at the very moment we need it, if we are open to it and can have the wisdom to make use of this new information to reach higher levels of consciousness. But it's generally all contained within the fullness of a single kalpa, a single universe, which is like a block it's a work of art that is all here now. Time is an illusion. So from the beginning of time to the end is one circle, one wholeness that's all actually here, even though the ego thinks it's going linearly through time. But that's an illusion. And the termas, in a way, prove that illusion because they are able to put information into the future that we will receive at just the right point when we can use it and need it.
So does the continuity of consciousness goes back to the beginning in a way?
Yeah,
not
of course.
to a new beginning of the same.
Well, the continuity at the level of the Buddha nature or the absolute, yes, but not in terms of the soul or the ego only has one life, that it has a very short sense of time. The soul has a much more expanded one, but the absolute, that is the creative intelligence that produces the entire cosmos instantaneously because it's beyond time. That is its present moment. There's a very interesting work being done by a physicist today named Bernard Carr, and he has this idea. Called the specious present. And it turns out that in normal states of consciousness, of waking consciousness, the human being has a specious meaning false, right? A false present of about 1/10 of a second. So that anything that happens within 1/10 of a second will all be considered happening simultaneously, even though something may happen at the beginning of that 1/10 and something else happening later. But that's it. And in altered states of consciousness, the specious present may increase so that a whole day is like an instant, or a longer period, or a much shorter period. So everyone at different levels of consciousness and in different states will have a different kind of present. And the present will come in blocks that seem to be the way that time moves, even though it doesn't really move at all. But you can get into states where your specious present includes all of time, includes the whole thing. And then you'd be liberated from it, and you'd realize that the whole cosmos, from beginning to end, was a thought in the mind of God, and that you are that mind. And it's all laid out for you here and now, and you're beyond the illusion of time. It's all here. And so, but then there are other states in which you'll get a subset of that amount of present. And then even beyond that, there's presence to the multiverse, at levels of consciousness that are inconceivable to us until we've gotten to the liberated state. So everyone is living in a different present that contains a different amount of information, and that extends for a different amount of clock time, let's say, which is illusory, and in which the subjectivity of the amount of information that is actually available at any given moment of that specious present may be very rich or may be very impoverished, depending on the defenses against overload of information. But if you have gone beyond the need to defend, then all of the information of reality is available, because that's what you are. It's the texture of your being is made of that information, and it is emitted out of your intelligence. And so once you are in that state, then there is nothing separate from you, and everything that arises is simply an unfoldment of the implicate order of that infinite nature of your being that manifests at different moments of the specious present that appear.
So when it's limited, as you were speaking about, it's consciousness experiencing from a soul level, not yet the full
ego
spectrum.
or soul, yes,
Okay.
right. Because the Atman is beyond the sense of experience or even imperience. It's beyond the sense of inner or outer. That still belongs to a lower level of consciousness.
And the continuity of consciousness that arises in the new earth, I guess, is from the Atman level.
Yes. So it's in eternal consciousness. You can't even really talk about continuity so much, because it's in a present that is without end, let's say.
And if you don't awaken to this consciousness before the singularity, then you stay in the soul level,
or the ego
next,
level, or whatever level you were in at the end is the level you're going to have to start from.
Until the time when you can
Yeah.
awaken. And
Sure. So those sanskaras that'll be in suspended animation can only come down into a world that resonates at the level in which those will fit and make sense. So you don't want to doom yourself to needing to be in another Kali Yuga, right? So, but that's generally what will happen, which is why there's such a huge population of souls now. And there were the population of humans on the earth was very small until even just 1900. There was only 1 billion or less, and the population was tiny compared to what we now take for granted. And the earth had plenty of space for everyone. So there will again be that kind of situation where there'll be no crowding, social distancing, but from a sense of having a tremendous amount of space and land and property, but that is all in a state of joyous sharing and commonwealth, not of any capitalistic territoriality.
The last question. So you can go through lifetimes and lifetimes in all of these yugas and then again in the next cycle of yugas.
If you don't graduate,
Yeah.
yeah. If you don't graduate, then you've got to go through it, but you'll hopefully go through it in a more conscious way. Mm-hmm.
I hope. Thank you.
You have a question?
No, yeah, it's quick.
Okay.
Thanks. It's just because you're talking about this, the soul consciousness, ego consciousness, and this. And so I didn't realize that the absolute was like a very high level, and I came here like wanting to be a Buddha already in liberation.
Well, you are a Buddha already. Yeah,
well,
that's
I
good.
need to be aware then of it. But so my question is about suffering, because if I understand correctly, this in soul consciousness, when the ego dies, that's where suffering ends, right? In the death of the ego. So in soul consciousness, there is no more suffering, no more illusion of suffering.
It's a different kind of suffering. There still is suffering in the sense of learning and growth, and having to deal with whatever ways the soul has still attachments, either to other souls or to unfinished karma that still may need to be completed. But what the soul understands that the ego doesn't is that all of the characters in your reality are parts of yourself. There are not other people. If for the ego there's other people and I hate some of them and I desire other ones and I have other projections on others, and so one is living in a world of enemies and frenemies and other kinds of relations, whereas at the soul level one realizes these are parts of oneself and one gradually unifies these different parts, and once they are integrated, then you transcend the soul level and you reach the spirit. But that integration may involve some suffering, because you have to accept your shadow, you have to work through internal conflicts that are still there within the soul. But at least you know they're internal, and then you're able to come to a resolution. All right. Well, I hope this has been useful to people, and I've appreciated being tested with all these advanced questions, and it's great to have such a lively group of seekers who are really struggling to grow to full understanding, and we're all in this process of growth together, and I appreciate the contributions and the energy field of symbolic intelligence that is leading us as a field of consciousness to grow to ever higher levels of intersubjectivity and unification and love and joy and freedom from projections. So it's beautiful to be a part of this spiritual process of growth that everyone here has voluntarily signed up for to unravel and rip apart their ego masks and become real and pure and beautiful and free again. Thank you all. Namaste.